Hi gang, it's election day. As I post this, it is the day of the 2024 UK general election, a time when the declining Imperium of Great Britain and Northern Ireland vote to see who will be the new High Lords of Terror. I've voted already, but if you're unsure of who the hell everyone is, or just from somewhere outside the UK and have no idea who any of these people are, don't worry, because in this video, I'm going to explain it all using the most appropriate analogy. Characters from Warhammer 40k. Let's find out who are the Warmasters and who are the luckless Servitors. I mean, that's us, right? We're the Servitors. So it's often said that Warhammer is a satire, in part of British politics in the 1980s, but that analogy has never completely gone away. A once powerful empire that dominated the known galaxy, crumbling into squalor for 10,000 years and ruled over by squabbling nobles and the rotting corpse of a monarch on a golden throne, the United Kingdom has quite a lot in common with the Imperium of Man. So in this video, written at the very last minute with the help of the Discord, thanks everybody, I'm going to go through the main players in today's election, what they're known for, and who their 40k counterpart would be. But before we get into that, we should probably do some background information for those who don't know how the British government, quote marks, works. This is going to be very basic, so don't at me, but a general election decides who gets to govern the United Kingdom and who's going to be the Prime Minister. But we don't actually vote for the Prime Minister. The UK is divided up into 650 parliamentary constituencies, each of which is represented by a single Minister of Parliament or MP. These MPs sit in the House of Commons and debate stuff and pass laws. There's also a House of Lords, which are unelected, but they're not important right now. In a general election, everyone votes for their local MP. The rule is that whichever MP can then command the support of the majority of the House of Commons is invited to form a government by the King. All very modern. In reality, this means that the MPs that you can vote for are all members of political parties, and if a political party can get 51% of the seats of the House, their party leader will become the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister then appoints various of their MPs to government posts, like the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is like the Finance Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the Defence Secretary. They form a government out of MPs that have been voted in their party. If no party can get 51% on their own, they can make an alliance of support with smaller parties. During their time in power, the government can propose new policies, which are then debated between the government on one side of the House and the second biggest party, who are called the opposition, on the other side of the House, and then all the MPs vote on whether they go through. Generally, a party will remain in government for either a maximum of 5 years or until they don't have the support of 51% anymore. The rest of the House can call votes of no confidence, but usually, if the government feel like that might happen, they'll call an election anyway, as it just looks a bit better for them. That's what's happening right now. Rishi Sunak, who was the Prime Minister, has called an election. It's happening today. Generally, this sort of thing produces a two-party system with a number of smaller parties all trying to make alliances in case the big two don't get 51%. In the UK, the two parties are the Conservatives, or Tories, who are either centre-right or just right-wing, depending on the time period, and who tend to be associated with the old aristocracy, big business, finance and tradition, and Labour, who are generally left to centre-left, again, depending on the time, and are traditionally based in unions, socialism and workers' rights, but have had to move a lot more to the centre in recent decades, partly because the news media in the UK is overwhelmingly right-wing, which has become a lot worse recently. So that's how the system works, but it's not maybe the best context, so a bit of recent history. In the late 90s through to the mid-2000s, the UK was generally doing doing quite well, I think, under the Labour government of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who got into power by mostly rebranding Labour and making them more slick and centrist. But scandals like the Iraq War and then the 2008 global banking crisis led to them being replaced in 2010 by the Conservatives. And because of the Conservatives, the last 14 years are generally seen as a shit show of underfunding, increased poverty, corruption, scandal and mismanagement by a succession of braying posh wankers, which has mostly resulted in the rich, who are the Tories, becoming richer and the poor becoming much, much poorer. The Tories have mostly managed to stay in power through this period because Labour didn't really have any good candidates to stand against them. One of the more promising ones was a guy called Jeremy Corbyn, a sort of Bernie Sanders, old Labour, left-wing figure who was massively popular on the left of the Labour Party and who got a lot more people to join the Labour Party and whose policies were actually quite popular. They were basically the same policies a Scandinavian country might have, but he was sort of portrayed by the media as a sort of old-fashioned 1970s communist, and to be fair, he wasn't very good at dissuading anyone of that notion, so he could never quite win over the support of the centre of British politics like Tony Blair had, and of course that caused a massive division in the Labour Party that took years to sort out. But now, after 14 years of Tory rule, even many of the people on the right can't really justify voting for them anymore. Anyway, let's enter the Warhammer section of this very tenuous video with the Ruinous Powers themselves. Who are the chaos spawn we've had to endure over the last 14 years? David Cameron swept into power in 2010, promising a new fresh start, mostly by following the same PR playbook that Tony Blair had in the 90s. He was younger and slicker than a lot of previous Tory candidates. He managed to convince the country that the lack of money was entirely due to Labour overspending and not the massive banking crisis, and embarked on this programme called austerity, insisting that running a country was just like running a household, which it isn't, and that we all needed to save money, which isn't really how country finances work. But anyway, people were convinced. This led to sweeping cuts in support, welfare, health and public services over the next decade, which has predictably tanked the quality of life and support that most people, especially on the lower incomes, receive. As a result of austerity, a huge amount of the people who are currently in receipt of welfare funding are actually in work. They just can't earn enough, and food bank use has gone through the roof, which is ridiculous in one of the richest countries in the world. Anyway, he also initiated Brexit, something he agreed to originally to appease the extreme right wing of his own party, expecting it to fail, since literally everyone said it would be a terrible idea. Of course, the Tories then split down the middle in a little civil war, and because of a very badly set up referendum, the people setting it up didn't think it would matter, a frankly lackluster Remain campaign, and a fair amount of voter apathy. Lots of people just believed it had never happened, so they didn't vote. Brexit actually went through, and Cameron resigned. David Cameron will be represented here by Horus Lupercal. The architect of the Horus heresy was charismatic enough to convince everyone to follow his plans, and then initiated an ill-advised rebellion, which included bleeding dry a number of planets in the name of his own ideology. Because of the nature of that rebellion, it quickly got out of control, his own lieutenants proving impossible to predict, and there was a small civil war in their ranks, and then he dithered about at the last minute when he reached Terra, before finally, embarrassingly, losing. There, the architect of all the chaos of the last 14 years, Horus David Cameron Lupercal. Cameron was succeeded by Theresa May. She's famous for a series of very awkward and embarrassing public appearances, and she had the unenviable job of attempting to negotiate what Brexit was going to be in a way that represented the fact that not many people in the country actually wanted it, all while her own party was split in two and one half were yelling for the most extreme Brexit possible. It was a pretty impossible task, so Theresa May is represented here by another haunted skeleton, Mortarion, who was also caught between a rock and a hard place. Mortarion was on the side of Horus, but really resistant to the actual falling to chaos bit, and he was caught between his desire to protect his legion from corruption and the much more chaos-friendly elements within it. Eventually, trapped in the warp with literally no options remaining, he had to accept reality and then fall to chaos fully, damning his legion to a half-existence as Plague Marines, which is about to become relevant. After she resigned in 2019, our next Tory Prime Minister was Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson was a well-known public figure, a tabloid journalist with a persona of like some sort of bumbling comedy bully. He'd previously been a completely incompetent mayor of London. He was the sort of posh aristocrat who doesn't believe any of the rules should apply to him, and he was mostly concerned with just getting the title of Prime Minister like his hero Churchill. He would say anything that got himself closer to that goal. So he came into power by saying that he'd enact a populist hard Brexit regardless of the consequences, which he did, claimed a great victory for doing so, and then immediately had to deal with the COVID pandemic, which was a real serious crisis that someone like him was not equipped to deal with. Boris Johnson avoided the initial COVID meetings, decided not to cooperate with the EU, dismissed the threat to life at almost every turn, and then when that started to look bad and his PR people said maybe you should take it seriously, he imposed a series of lockdown rules that he personally completely ignored, holding regular garden parties in government buildings while the rest of the country were in lockdown. Johnson's time in power in the UK is almost synonymous with like ludicrous levels of government scandal and corruption. Not only the garden parties and his own carelessness, his government also handed out millions of pounds of lucrative contracts to their personal friends to provide COVID protection equipment that never worked. They also lied to the Queen to unlawfully suspend Parliament so that no one could scrutinise his Brexit plans as they were going through. So, a larger-than-life figure who believes that the rules of reality don't apply to him, a dishevelled mess whose mismanagement let a disease run wild, killing thousands of people, and coincidentally, who has potentially hundreds of children, Boris Johnson is Nurgle. Yep, the actual festering god of disease. Nurgle would have loved the way the UK handled COVID. Boris finally resigned and was replaced by Liz Truss, most famous for writing a book full of terrible economic policy that, despite all warnings to the contrary, she immediately implemented, leading to such a backlash from financial institutions that interest rates skyrocketed and everyone's mortgage doubled. She is the shortest tenured British Prime Minister in history, lasting only 49 days before she was replaced. In 40k terms, this was a bit difficult. I was very tempted to compare her to a ploin, the sort of fruit thing everyone in 40k eats, because there was this running joke in the UK that a lettuce would last longer than she did. But eventually, I've gone for Magnus the Red, also someone who was absolutely convinced they knew best, and despite being repeatedly told not to, went ahead and made an incredibly damaging decision that caused massive harm to everyone on Terra, and was then immediately turned upon by their own side. Liz Truss, just like Magnus the Red, did everything wrong. And then finally, Liz was replaced by Rishi Sunak, a former Chancellor of the Exchequer and former hedge fund banker, who conveniently was one of those at the time of that 2008 banking crisis. He is the richest Prime Minister ever, and has so far spent his time being basically completely ineffectual. No one knows why he called the election so early for sure. He could have stuck it out for a few more years, but the speculation is that he's basically looking to move to California. His father-in-law owns a colossal tech company, Infosys, and they've already gotten as many government contracts out of the Tories as they possibly can, so there's no need for him to be Prime Minister, and doing the election in July times out well with his kids moving school. At least that's the actual suggestion why he might have called it early. It's entirely self-serving. Sunak was a really hard one for me to find a comparison for because he's so simultaneously self-serving and boring, but I'm going to go with Kelbor Hal, the Fabricator General of the Mechanicum in the Horus Heresy. He spent years working behind the scenes as Horus planned his rebellion, lured by promises of riches, the forbidden knowledge in the vaults of Moravec, which means he's basically a robot who's only out to feather his own nest, which sounds exactly like Sunak. So there we go. The forces of the Tories over the last 14 years started out with quite a lot of public support and managed to hold on to it in the face of pretty incompetent opposition. But in the last few years, it's become pretty clear to everyone that they have no chance at all. It's almost a dead certainty that they cannot win today's election. They might even do so badly that they'd fail to be the opposition. But which popular figures from 40k are standing against them? I'm sticking with the theme here. Which warlords, tyrants and bureaucrats can the good servitors of the Imperium actually vote for instead? Well, obviously, first on the ballot, we've got Kelbor Sunak standing for the Conservatives, but the polls are looking really bad, so he'll be off to the hellforge of a California tech company any day now. There are loads of smaller parties in contention, and we'll get to them, but the real challenger, let's be honest, the one who is going to win, is the leader of the Labour Party, Keir Starmer. Represented here, bear with me on this, by Robute Gilliman. I know, but stick with it. Like Gilliman, Keir Starmer is kind of boring. He's also a big fan of law and order and organisation. He's a former lawyer specialising in human rights. He also used to be the head of the Crown Prosecution Service, the government department who prosecute crime on behalf of the state rather than like civil matters. And he's not nearly interesting enough to have any particularly great scandals in his past. Also, like the least interesting Primarch, he's kind of the only choice. Gilliman took power on account of being the only Primarch able to do so. Keir Starmer is going to win because he's in charge of the Labour Party, and most people just really don't want the Tories to win. Also, like Gilliman, he's had to moderate his opinions a bit, which is contentious. Gilliman in 40k is a massive opponent of the idea that the Emperor is a god, but he's had to kind of hold back on that opinion so as to avoid a civil war. The rest of the Imperium definitely think he's a divine figure. And in a similar way, Starmer's actual politics are probably a bit more left than the party would like to publicise, but they've been trying to appear as centrist as possible over the last few months in order to win over the middle of the country and avoid what happened to Corbyn, which predictably has led to loads of internal criticism from the left wing of the party. He could probably get away with being a bit more left-wing, but I do understand that they really don't want to fuck this up. Basically, every single poll says that despite nobody actually being a fan of Starmer or maybe really wanting to vote for him, he's definitely going to win. And the Labour Party are trying to appear as centrist and moderate as possible to not screw that up. What they actually do when they get in power is hopefully a different thing. So there, Robute Gilliman, the Primarch no one wanted, but the one that was there. Anyway, look, he's going to win, but there are other people you could vote for. The third party of British politics has traditionally been the Liberal Democrats, and they're kind of a weird one. Depending on your political stance, they're either a centre-left party but not as left as Labour, or they're the Tories, just less horrible. Because of their position in the middle of those two, they tend to do well when those bigger parties are mired in scandal, and they're often people's like second choice. They also infamously backed the Tories in 2010, which allowed this whole shit show to start, and that lost them a lot of support on the left, obviously. Their leader is Ed Davey, who's tried to distract from all that with a series of crazy campaign stunts, and who I'm representing here by Segarak, laughing god of the Harlequins. The Harlequins are part of the Eldari, who were the same faction that enabled an awful lot of the chaos. They float between two sides without ever committing to either, and they spend their time engaging in crazy stunts. Way less fun than the Lib Dems, though, is the newest party here, Reform UK. Reform follow in the footsteps of their predecessors, UKIP and the British National Party, as being the party you vote for if you're a racist. Like all of those, they pretend to be a real party with lots of policies, but in reality they run on a totally anti-immigration platform. Their leader, Nigel Farage, is a sort of oily lizard of a man who, despite being just another posh banker, has managed to sort of portray himself as a man of the people. In his previous role as the leader of the UK Independence Party, he was the one who originally campaigned for Brexit, massively enriching himself in the process of it. He's a fan of both Trump and Putin. He's well known for extremely badly concealed fascist tendencies, and he even set Reform UK up as a company rather than a political party so that he didn't have to abide by the party funding rules. Reform UK won't win many actual seats, but they are hoovering up a lot of votes from the previous right wing of the Tory party, and Nigel Farage is going to make a lot of money out of membership fees and merch sold to those idiots, all while playing the part of the real voice of the people. Look, it's tempting to cast him as some sort of gene stealer cult demagogue. After all, he is very, very concerned with people's genetics, but to be honest, the gene stealer cults have a much more positive immigration policy. No, as the person responsible for luring this lot to the side of Brexit, he's obviously going to be a word bearer, and so here I've chosen the most self-serving word bearer, the only word bearer who's actually in it just for his own personal gain. Nigel Farage is obviously Erebus. Right, below them we have the Green Party. The Greens are obviously the party who mostly advocate for the environment, and they mix that with a generally left-wing economic policy. They get a fair amount of support in local elections, but they usually do very badly in national ones. They're also the only party who currently have two leaders who share the job. Currently, Carla Denyer and Adrian Ramsey. Look, we could go through a torturous comparison process here, but they're green, they really like vegetables, tenuous link, but I'm going with it, and they've got two leaders, so they are represented by Gork and Mork of the Orcs. And below that, there are a number of either very small parties, only standing in one or two places, or local parties. Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland all have their own political parties that only run within their borders. On this chart you can see Plaid Cymru right at the bottom here, who only run in Wales, and even below that will be the DUP and Sinn Féin in Northern Ireland. But to be honest, I'm in London, so I don't really know enough about them or their leaders to make a good comparison. Suggestions in the comments if you can. But a special mention here to the Scottish National Party, who you can see are on this graph because they run all over Scotland, and Scotland has more people in it than the other two. The Scottish National Party mostly campaign for the independence of Scotland as a nation, and they're big enough to have forced a referendum on that issue back in 2014, but it failed ironically because, in part, lots of people in Scotland were worried about not being allowed in the EU if they left the UK, which then of course voted to leave the EU 2 years later, against the wishes of Scotland. Their leader is John Swinney, who's quite new, but in this, he will be playing the part of Perturabo of the Iron Warriors. Assigned to endless sieges and grueling campaigns of attrition, Perturabo and the Iron Warriors felt overlooked, unacknowledged, and resentful of the wider country. But when they switched sides to Horus, the same thing just happened again. Perturabo and his gang eventually quit the Siege of Terror and sailed off into the warp to independence, let's say, on their fortress world of Medrengard, a planet of steel, iron, girders and oil. Just like Scotland, right? And if Scotland can do the same, that would be really useful because it's the only way I'm going to get a European passport anytime soon. Anyway, there we go. Your options in the election today. If you have any more suggestions, post them below. I haven't covered every major player. And if you haven't already, remember to go and vote. I mean, it looks like Gilliman's going to be in charge, whatever you do, but I could do without Erebus sitting on the bench opposite him for the next 5 years, if you know what I mean. See? Who said politics didn't belong in Warhammer? Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to see some real lore videos about the world of Warhammer 40k, there should be one just popping up to the right, and if you'd like to support the channel, there's all the usual things in the links below, including YouTube memberships and Patreons, both of which have Discord access at certain levels, so maybe you could advise me on the next mad one of these I do. Anyway, see ya.